Visual Perception, Chapter 3. Here's a list of some questions of interest. How can we perceive an object such as a chair as having a stable form, given that the image of the chair on our retina changes as we look at it from different directions? What are two fundamental approaches to explaining perception? And finally, what happens when people with normal vision sensations cannot perceive visual stimuli? So, what is perception? Perception is the process of recognizing, organizing, and interpreting information. So the word process is important here. In order to process information, we have to have some sort of knowledge, just like a computer needs an app to process information, such as photos and videos. Now, let's take a look at an example. Can you recognize what this is? Please pause the video and see if you can figure out what you are looking at. Okay, so did you get it? This is an image of a cow. In the past, some of my students were able to recognize it immediately. Others took some time, and a few students were never able to see what it is, even after I told them what it is. If you didn't see a cow, but now you do, after I told you what it is, then that's an example of top-down processing. The information you just acquired becomes a knowledge, and this knowledge drives you to perceive the world. We'll discuss more about the top-down processing later. Now, sometimes we perceive things that do not exist. For instance, there are two triangles in the left and two triangles in the right. Or do you think that's an illusion? So let's now take a look at how our visual system works. Photons travel through the cornea, pupil, and the lens changes its shape to focus, which is called accommodation. And the image is projected on the retina, where electromagnetic light energy is converted into neural electrochemical impulses. Sclera, the white outer layer of the eyeball, limit the light to get into the retina. Optic disc is the exit point from the retina of the fibers of the ganglion cells that form the optic nerve. And this exit is called blind spot because there is no retina. Fovea is the tiny spot on the retina that is well suited for highly detailed vision. On the fovea, there are few blood vessels and ganglion cells, but the receptors are tightly packed. Okay, there are three main layers of neural tissues in the retina. Please note that the light comes from top to bottom, and it may be a bit confusing, but all the nerve cells and optic nerve fibers are located on top of the photoreceptors. Okay, now let's take a look at three cells. First one is ganglion cells that is located in the retina that receives visual information from bipolar cells. Axons of ganglion cells give rise to the optic nerve. Amacrine cells interconnects adjacent ganglion cells and the inner processes of the bipolar cells. The third one is horizontal cells. Those cells interconnect adjacent photoreceptors and the outer processes of the bipolar cells. Now, photoreceptors consist of cones and rods. There are 7 million cones in each eye, and they are responsible for color perception. Cones are most active during the daytime and has a high spatial resolution, but they have low sensitivity. These photoreceptors can mainly be found in fovea. There are 125 million rods in each eye, and they are responsible for light perception. Rods have high sensitivity, so we use rods in the dark. Rods have low spatial information and can be found in peripheral or evenly distributed throughout the retina except for the fovea. Now, brain has two pathways in visual perception. One pathway is for identifying what information and where information. Once electrochemical impulses are conveyed through optic nerve and reach the primary visual cortex, visual information takes two pathways. The ventral stream, which goes toward the bottom of the brain, is involved in the perception of form, what information. And dorsal stream, which goes upward, is involved in the perception of spatial location, where. Next, we will discuss several theories that explain how we make sense of what we see and what we perceive. Many visual perception theories are classified into either bottom-up theories or top-down theories. According to bottom-up theories, parts are identified, put together, and then recognition occurs. In contrast, the top-down theories predict people actively construct perceptions using information based on expectations. Now let's take a look at several specific theories in each. So first we will discuss 4 bottom-up theories. Okay, direct perception. According to Gibson, perception of information is the direct result from the environment, and his theory asserts that the array of information in the sensory receptors is all that is needed for an individual to perceive anything. That means prior knowledge or thought processes are not necessary for perception. His rationale was that the stimulus contains enough information for correct perception and does not require internal representations for perception. If you look at this picture on the slide, we use texture gradients as cues for depth and distance, and which allows us to perceive directly the relative proximity or distance of objects. Next, template theories. According to this template matching theories, recognition of visual pattern occurs by matching sensory stimuli to an internal construct. Pattern recognition occurs when a match is made between sensory stimuli and the corresponding internal mental form. Templates are highly detailed models for patterns we potentially might recognize. We recognize a pattern by comparing it with our sets of templates and then choosing the exact template that perfectly matches what we observe, just like matching fingerprints or barcodes. One major weakness in template matching theory is that it requires countless millions of templates to be found in order to recognize each geometric form we see and recognize. Okay, next, feature matching theories. So maybe we attempt to match features of a pattern to features stored in memory rather than to match a whole pattern to a template or a prototype. This is called feature analysis or feature matching theories. So this Panamanian model is an example of feature matching model, and this explains how letters are recognized. The flow of information is strictly bottom-up, and one letter is processed at a time in a serial manner. According to this model, there are 4 discrete stages or daemons in word recognition system. First, image daemon receives sensory input where iconic memory of letters are temporarily stored. Feature daemon is sensitive to features like curves, horizontal lines, and so forth. There are 28 features determined by the feature daemons. Then the representations of letters with possible features are activated in the cognitive daemons. And finally, the representation that best matches the input is selected in the decision daemon. Next, I will demonstrate how information is processed depends on how they are spaced out. We will take a look at 2 effects. The first one is global precedence effect. As you can see on the slide, globally, the group of small letter h to your left and the group of small letter s also form the big letter H to your right. But locally, the left big letter consists of a bunch of letter H, and the right big letter H consists of a bunch of letter S. As you can see, small letters are clustered together, and when there is not much space between small letters, participants were quicker to identify the big letter than the smaller letter. Participants were also quicker to identify the small letter if small letter is the same with the big letter. So what this means is that global information dominates over local information. But if each of the local letters are widely spaced, the effect is reversed. This is called local precedence effect. Participants are now faster to identify the local features than the global features, and the local features interfere with the global recognition in case of contradictory stimuli. So a few slides ago, we discussed feature matching theories. Now there is a study in neuroscience to back up their theories. David Hubble and Torsten Wiesel discovered that cells in our visual cortex become activated only when they detect the sensation of line segments of particular orientations. In other words, there are brain cells that are activated only for certain orientations. In their study, the single-cell recording technique was used to record brain activity of a cat. You see in this drawing, it looks like it's a monkey, but in their original study, they use a cat. Now, as you can see in this diagram, there is hardly any activation when the cell is presented with horizontal line segment. There's more activation when the line is diagonally oriented, and when the line is vertical, the cell reacts with even more activation. So you might ask, why do we have dedicated brain cells to detect bars and orientations? Well, Think about it. When we walk on a narrow bridge, it is important for us to know where the edge is to avoid falling from the bridge. If we fail to detect an edge of objects, we cannot tell if we are looking at one object or multiple ones. Okay, next. Biederman proposed geon theory to describe how 3D images are identified. He breaks objects down into geons and suggested that objects are identified by geons and relationship between them. To Biederman, just like alphabets that can be assembled to form any words, geons can also be assembled anyway to form any 3D objects. So, for example, a mug is composed of regular cylinder and bent cylinder. Another example is a bag that is composed of cuboid object and bent cylinder. Of course, his theory is not free from criticisms. For instance, here's a mug which consists of geon 7, which is cylinder, and geon 10, curved cylinder. If I partially hide this mug, can you still recognize it as a mug even though your recognition of geons is impaired? Okay, now we're gonna move on to the top-down theories. Top-down process is a constructive perception in which we, the perceivers, build a cognitive understanding of a stimulus. In other words, we need knowledge and experience to build perception to digest information. Top-down processing occurs very quickly and involves making inferences, guessing from experience, and basing one perception on another. For example, when my middle child, Masako, 1 to 2 years old, she learned what doggy is because we have a dog named Ch03. In her mind, all furry four-leg animals are doggy. One day she saw a horse, but she called it doggy. I corrected it, so now all big four-leg animals are horsey, and all small four-leg animals are doggy. But then she encountered a cat. It looks kind of like a doggy or horse, but a bit different. I taught her it is a kitty, so now she knows some animals look kind of similar but different. Through this process, she has built a schema, which is a dynamic framework of knowledge to perceive an information. As she continues to learn a lot of different animals, her schema of animals becomes more and more sophisticated. Now, let's take a look at another example of top-down processing. This is called configural superiority effect. Now, what letter do you see on the slide? Does it look like an H? Now, can you read these two words? You read the cat. But as you can see, even though the physical characteristics of the H-shaped letter between T and E is identical to the one between the letter C and T, you still have no issues reading the cat. Here's another example. Let's assume that you have been driving in the US since you were 16 and you are a good driver. Also assume you don't speak Japanese at all. But you are brave enough to drive a car in Japan anyway, even though cars drive on the left side of the road and you cannot read Japanese. So now you are approaching an intersection and see a red sign says tomare in Japanese. So my question is, what would you do? Even though the shape of the sign is not octagon and not written in the language you know, you will probably stop. Now, why is that? Well, that is because you have a previous experience and knowledge that when you are approaching an intersection, you are supposed to either stop or slow down, especially when you see a sign in red. So in this situation, with the proper knowledge and experience, you can probably correctly guess what the sign says, even if you don't read Japanese. And this is an example of top-down processing. Now, if you only use bottom-up processing, you probably cannot read it because you have to analyze each of the letters. And there's no way for you to do it because you don't know the language. So I was curious about what the stop signs look like in different countries. So here's some of the stop signs that I found on the internet. This one is from Thailand. This is from Mexico. And this is in Arabic, so it could be from Morocco or Egypt. This is from France, Malaysia, Hawaii, Korea. And I found this sign. I think this is for construction, and it's if the information is correct, it's from Ghana. Great Britain, German, China and Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the United States. So, which process explains better how we perceive the world? The answer is perhaps a bit of both. Human cognition is not that simple that can be explained just by a single theory. As discussed earlier, there are brain cells that are activated only by certain orientations, which is the evidence to support bottom-up processing, but we also perceive information based on what we already know, like schema. When we discuss perception in psychology courses, you might think of Gestalt psychology. For example, look at this figure. It looks like a part of circle, right? But when a bunch of other similar looking figures are combined, you now see a cube. This is an example of the whole is more than a sum of its parts, and this is a Gestalt principle. However, early Gestalt psychologists did not intend to focus only on perception. Rather, Gestalt psychology was about general psychology. They believed that the concept the whole is more than a sum of parts should be the underlying principle in psychology. According to Wertheimer, one of the founders of Gestalt psychology, some patterns seem to be naturally organized. Now let's take a look at some of the principles in Gestalt psychology. First one is proximity. We tend to see objects that are close to each other as forming a group. So we tend to see these dots are in one group, not like this or not like this. Next, we tend to group objects on the basis of their similarity. So we tend to group these dots together, and we tend to group these dots together, but probably not like this. Okay, next, good continuation or continuity. We tend to perceive smoothly flowing or continuous forms rather than disrupted or discontinuous ones. So this tends to be perceived as a continuous bar rather than the separate bars. Okay, next, closure. We tend to perceptually close up or complete objects that are not in fact complete. So we perceive this collection of parts as a cube, even though it is an incomplete figure. We close the gap in our mind, but in the physical world, there are no lines. Symmetry. We tend to perceive objects as forming mirror images about their center. Next, law of pregnance. This means a good figure. Individuals organize their experience in as simple, concise, symmetrical, and a complete manner as possible. So we prefer to perceive A over B because A is simpler. Next, figure ground. Our cognition organizes the visual field into objects that stand out from their surroundings, and we have a tendency to perceive that an object in or an aspect of a perceptual field seems prominent, whereas other objects or aspects recede into the background. So this figure ground reversals one or the other, not both. For example, in the FedEx logo, when you focus on the word FedEx, it becomes figure and everything else becomes ground. But when you focus on the arrow between letter E and X, the word becomes ground. You cannot simultaneously perceive both as figure and ground. Edgar Rubin's vase is another example of figure ground. When you attend to the shadow of the two individuals facing each other, the vase becomes a background. When you focus on the vase, two individuals become a background. Next, we will discuss recognizing patterns and faces. When an object is processed, we use two separate systems. One is the feature analysis system, which is largely processed in the left hemisphere, the left brain. This system recognizes parts and objects. The configural system, on the other hand, is largely processed in the right hemisphere or right brain. This system recognizes larger configurations in a holistic way. Now, research suggests that even though a face is a type of visual object, it is processed differently from known face objects. More specifically, faces tend to be processed as a whole object, whereas known face objects such as houses are analytically processed. So in other words, faces are special visual objects that we treat them very differently from known face objects. Let me show you some of the examples that indicate faces are indeed special. More than a decade ago, Diana Duzar of Hollywood, Florida, received a religious message through an unlikely medium. a grilled cheese sandwich she made herself. As she gazed at the brown skillet marks on the surface of the bread, a familiar visage snapped into focus, and she said, "I saw a face looking up at me. It was the Virgin Mary staring back," she told reporters in 2004. So she must be a very religious woman, right? So she decided to sell it on eBay. Not sure if it was sold or not. Here's another example. There are numerous number of examples that people see faces in the random patterns. Surface of the Mars, the cinnamon bun, smoke, wall outlet, the faucet, and even the three dots. So we have a tendency to see a face everywhere, but we don't have tendency to see any other known face objects anywhere. So that means we treat faces and known face objects very differently. So there is accumulated behavior evidence to support the idea that face is very different from known face objects, and neurological findings confirm this. For example, there is a part of the right temporal cortex called fusiform gyrus, which is thought to be activated in facial recognition. This area is also known as a face fusiform gyrus, but this region is activated in someone who is an expert of recognizing known face objects, such as car salespeople when recognizing cars, or biologists when recognizing cells. Now, when fusiform gyrus is damaged, individuals may develop prosopagnosia. This is a condition with inability to recognize faces, but their ability to recognize objects is intact. Remarkably, patients with prosopagnosia also cannot recognize their own face. So every morning they may see their face while brushing their teeth, but can't recognize who they are looking at. Because their family members cannot be recognized by looking at their faces, patients oftentimes ask their families to wear necklace, earrings, or hat so they can easily recognize them. Associative agnosia is similar to prosopagnosia, but patients experience difficulty when recognizing objects, but they can recognize faces. This indicates that faces and known face objects are processed differently. Okay, next we discuss depth perception. This is the ability to see the world in 3Ds and detect distance. Since our vision only has two-dimensional view, we must interpret the information given to perceive depth. In the next several slides, I will show you some of the monocular depth cues. I bet some of you have already seen this figure, but what if I told you the tile A and the tile B are the same color? Now, in fact, they are. This is an example of color constancy. Do you see that? Tile A and tile B are exactly the same color. But our brain interprets that B is lighter than A because we know in the real world that there is a shadow on B. Therefore, even if it looks darker, it shouldn't be dark in the real world. Okay, next, linear perspective. If there are parallel lines, they converge in distance, and this gives a cue that there is a depth. This picture also shows a relative size in which crops closer to us look bigger and those far away from us look smaller. Texture of closer crops look more detailed, whereas far away crops look less detailed. This relative size also gives a depth cue. In the real world, if there are two objects, the closer object should look bigger than the object far away from us. When we have a visual depth cue, two objects that are physically identical don't look identical in size. Okay, so in this picture, there are two monsters. They look identical except its size. But are they different? Let's find out. So here is the height of this monster to the left, and those two monsters are actually the same height. Here's another example that shows the depth cue distort the size or shape of an object. These lines are interpreted in our brain that the right end is far away from us, whereas the left end is close to us. And this depth cue distorts the shape of the square. Okay, next, even the view of the blue car is partially blocked by two individuals. Our brain can still perceive it as a car. This is because of the shape constancy. This photo also shows size constancy. The blue car does not look too small for humans to drive, even though apparent size is actually small. Now, the people don't appear to be giant because we know they are simply close to us. Shape constancy is the ability to perceive an object's shape as constant despite changes in its orientation and the angle from which one views it. On the retina, the shape of the door from left to right continuously changes, but our brain perceives it as an opening door. Okay, next we're gonna look at the binocular depth cues. So first one is binocular disparity. Each eye views a slightly different angle of an object, and our brain uses this to create a 3D image. Binocular convergence, on the other hand, uses the neural signals from the muscles that are attached to each of the eyes. The eyes turn inward as object moves towards you, and this information is used by the brain to judge distance. Now, what if we have deficit in our perception? What do you think will happen? So we are finishing up this chapter with the deficits in perception. Patients with agnosia experience an inability to recognize and identify objects or people, despite having knowledge of the characteristics of the objects or people. This shows that specialization of our perceptual systems. This is a deficit in visual perception in the absence of blindness. Rather, it is caused by brain damage, usually temporal cortex. So as you can see in this diagram, the patients with agnosia have no idea by looking at an object. So as you can see in this diagram, patients with agnosia cannot figure out what she's looking at until she touched the object. But if you have memory loss, you have no idea what you're looking, and you still don't know what you're looking at even when you are touching it. As this diagram shows, the patient with agnosia does not have a memory loss nor blindness. They have normal memory and their vision is fine, but they have trouble perceiving an object. The patients with balance syndrome behave as if they can recognize only one object at a time. This deficit seems like an extreme form of extinct or neglect in that attending to one object eliminates everything else. This inability to perceive more than one thing at a time is known as simultagnosia. Now let's take a look at the second figure. The top left-hand corner shows a patient with balance syndrome being able to say the color of the dots, which is red. The second image shows that she was successfully able to detect that there are green dots on the screen. But due to her condition, when two colors are mixed, she cannot attend both of the colors at the same time. However, this is interesting. When two dots with different colors are connected to create a single object, she now can recognize two colors. Okay, so this is it for this chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.